My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Institute, and because I recognize a lot of faces around the room, I don't think I need to go into a long explanation of what we do and what we stand for, but say simply we are conservative in culture, classical liberal in economics, and Atlanticist in foreign policy. Now, this occasion is one of the first of a new kind of evenings we are hoping to have. And these are evenings not of speeches and questions and answers, although we will be hoping that you will want to ask questions later, and we'll open the meeting to that, but instead a conversation. Conversations between, on this occasion, three very distinguished people who in different ways are knowledgeable about each other's subjects, but are knowledgeable from different standpoints. That of financier, that of foreign policy expert, that of economist and central banker. Now, almost any of these topics, each of them could speak on with more than competence, but we're expecting there'll be discussion back and forth, maybe some disagreement, but disagreement of a casual and civilized kind. Now, I'm going to begin well, I can't guarantee that, a bit about civilized, by the way, but never mind. I'm going to begin by asking Robert Agostinelli, our principal guest tonight, if first of all, I would say simply that Robert is a very well-known financier. He started from a modest background, born of Italian immigrant parents in New York. He has risen to become the founder of the Rhone Group, which is a major capital investment group. He will describe it better than I can. And he's done so in a relatively short time. I imagine between your graduation and your establishing the Rhone Group was a period of something like, what, 25, 30 years, something like that? 15, well, even more impressive. And so I'm going to introduce briefly our other two guests, because I think they're well known to everybody here, but Peter Agostinelli at the end is a former governor of the Bank of Hungary. He was a central banker in London also. He's a professor of economics at one of your great universities, the Corvinus University. He is, in addition to all these qualities, he has a quality very important to me as an editor. He's a wonderful writer, and one of the few people who can write about economics with wit, as well as with expertise. Secondly, Zsolt Nemeth. By the way, we might all say a lot of things about each other by the end that aren't so complimentary, but let's carry on like this for the moment. Zsolt Nemeth is one of the most distinguished Hungarian experts on foreign affairs. He's held several major positions in government, and he's the head of the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Policy. I know this from practice because I've encountered Zsolt across the table in places as different as the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., in various conferences that the New Atlantic Initiative held in Budapest, in Prague, and elsewhere, and in a political debate generally. So we have three very distinguished and interesting people. And so let me begin by just asking Robert about what, first of all, what do you do? What is a financier in today's world? What does the Rhone Group do, and how did you get there?
I knew people like you, John. That's how I got there. But no, first let me say I'm very pleased to be here. This is a country that I have a great empathy and warmth for, because on the course of history, as you know better than anyone, you've been on the front line against tyranny, and that's something that matters greatly to me personally. And you know, I almost lost my father fighting North Korea and the Chinese, two wonderful countries, and what you've done here over the years is just a marvel. And John being a close friend and as your Prime Minister told Nani and I this afternoon, a brave man, I'd say that all of you here are very brave, and to me it's great to be in your company. As to that question, John, what we do is we try to go the other way up the road of serfdom. That's what we do. And by that I mean we manage capital, our own capital, and the capital of many institutions and families around the globe. And we in turn take that money over long term, in this case 22 years in our firm's case, along with my partner Nani in front of us here, and the others, we basically buy companies in partnership with families or from other public companies. We groom them, we refine them, and ultimately, God willing, we sell them or take them public. And we've done that over, as I say, 22 years. And it's been, what's interesting about this business is that the reverse road to serfdom, when it's unencumbered by the lie, you can do quite well and quite quickly. And many people become better emotionally, happier, and wealthier. But you also find your way up that road, and there are a lot of obstacles, and there's regulation, there's taxation, we've been through all this in the chapter and verse, and it really just comes back to the kind of values we have. We see the reality. As my daughter told me yesterday, she's 18 and she's a model. She got her modeling contract, and she's working in a what's it called, a fruit developer of organic foods, and she got her first paycheck, and they took 40% away. So that was her indoctrination into the obstacles. So that's what we do, and we're proud of it. And we insist, by the way, in our firm, which is not customary in our business, I might also add, we insist that our young people, like the young gentleman I just met, are classical liberals. They have to believe what we believe. We are not politically correct. We don't allow people to think that way. They can think that way. We don't want them. They can think whatever they want to think, but it's free world. But in our firm, we want people to have our values. We find that's also very important.
That leads me on. That leads me on to an obvious question, which is, how do you explain what happened in 2008? Because a lot of people tend to blame the financial industry, the banks particularly, for what happened, and I wondered what your explanation is, because I would say more than almost anything else, the fiscal crisis of the crash of that year has undermined belief in the free market in Central and Eastern Europe more than anything else.
Well, that's true, and lies are like forest fires in California. They can start with just a small flint, and that was a big flint, and it was miscast. It was miscast by people like Obama. It was miscast by from the radical to the more innocent, and it was misunderstood by many. But capitalism had little to do with that debacle. That debacle, the seeds of that debacle were sown some years ago, really starting in the United States, frankly, and the ECB. We'll hear from our learned colleague on that. But basically, when you have money at such a low interest rate over such a sustained period of time, people pursue natural ways to find value. And it was in three pieces. This is the first piece. The first piece was that money was so cheap that to seek return, people pushed what's called the envelope. They pushed into certain situations and circumstances which were higher risk and presumably higher reward. And you had yourself the proverbial Dutch tulip bloom. Number two, in the United States, and the devil is always in the detail. Back to the obstacles on the road. In the United States, it used to be, when I was growing up as a kid, your parents would go to the bank, they'd show the banker what they were making for a living, they'd take a judgment of your character, and they would help you, give you a loan to help you buy a house within your means. And that was the American way. It was also the English way. It was the Anglo-Saxon way, in fact. But from the 60s and the misnamed Great Democracy move by Lyndon Johnson, the New Society, since the 208 debacle started in the second case there, because they started the road to federal agencies which insisted on social engineering and putting housing in the hands of people who could not afford it. And of course, like any opportunity of fool's gold, it mutates. And the mutation was, well, if I could do it for one house, why don't I do it for two houses? And when the banks, i.e. the capitalists, who were, pursued their own interest, they became worried and they started to hold back on that. And I'm talking specifically about the housing and urban development. I'm talking about the different quasi-notionally private organizations that were creating these funding, all of which were backed by the federal government. Warning signals were on the road all the way. When they did hesitate, then the Congress, led by the Democrats and certain cowardice of the Republicans, threatened them that if they were to do these racially biased acts against minorities, they would sue them, and they would sue them for tons and tons of money. This happened under the disastrous President Clinton. It happened under my friend George Bush. George Bush fought against that in his second administration, but he didn't have control of 2 houses of Congress, and therefore the banks relinquished. So the combustion of those 2 things led to what is the third element of this, back to the bubble. It led to these institutions then trying to download risk, and they were doing things. I'll give you one example in simple layman's terms. If you have a mortgage and you've given it to a person who has no money, to make it stark, and you have 2 other mortgages which are normal, you can put them together and you can say, well, one's bad, 2 are good. If I wrap them, it was called wrapping. If I wrap them around, then it looks like it's okay. And then you go to Europe, which parenthetically was following similar policies, which again our learned colleague Peter will mention in a minute, but you would then sell them, and you could sell them all around the globe. And so people were absorbing these securities at warp speed. There were all sorts of derivative forms of this, and then one day the music stopped. And like musical chairs, when it stops, in this case there were a lot of empty chairs, or a lot of chairs that were full, and there were no empty chairs, and you had a free fall. That's what led to the crash of 2008. And in my view, I was a partner with Hank Paulson at Goldman, who was the Secretary of Treasury. Paulson is a great man, but he's not exactly the individual you'd choose for something like this, because Hank was an investment banker. He didn't understand markets in this sense. This is a market issue, global market issue. But he called in people who at warp speed, within days, had to make massive decisions with the Federal Reserve Bank and the ECB. And I think, in my view, subject again to Peter's view, they made the right decision because they had, in the crash of 29, the thing that they did wrong is they tightened liquidity, and that led to a free fall worse. And they basically took liquidity and poured it into the money system at a rate that's never been touched. If you look at it graphically, it's scary. People don't ever look at this. And then, of course, the politicians turned around and said, the banks, the capitalists, they're the people that did this to us. This is an old wives' tale that's been there many times before. But in short, that's what happened.
Thank you very much. Well, Peter, this is obviously the point for you to come in and in a sense, present your analysis.
Well, I will not argue against this analysis because that squares with what I have learned. It's very interesting that there was a problem triggered by the too low interest rates, and when the problem hit the world economy, central banks reacted by lowering the interest rate to 0, and then after that lowering it below 0, quantitative easing. So there's something wrong with the globe, but that makes our life very interesting. The second comment is that it's very interesting to see that the blame was on the business sector, while everybody agrees that the populist policies of governments led to the overlanding, to ninjas, no income, no job, no asset, but still, if you want to borrow, why not? So it's populism. Now, we used the term populism recently in different contexts, but that was a populism. And also in Hungary, which was not mentioned, why Hungary was the first country to hit when this international crisis crossed the ocean. Okay, Iceland was the first, we were the second. And then came the island, the Greece, and too much debt, which also was, created by government policies, too much national debt and too much debt of the borrowers. Now, because this afternoon is not about monetary policy, I'm just point out the problems we are facing, that central banks are pretty good at measuring consumer price index. And if there's the CPI is high, or retail price index in England, then we know that we have to apply the classical methods, increasing interest. But what if the figures are fine, but there's a bubble with the assets? And this bubble is very hard to measure. What is bubble to me is an opportunity to the investors. So who can tell the real value of an asset? And people get very rich or can lose a lot of money on the change of the price of assets, like shares or bonds or real estate, others. While the central bankers should know that this is a bubble, and if it's a bubble, I should puncture it carefully. But who can tell the underlying value of an asset? If people are happy to buy a share of, say, IBM, then IBM is a good investment. And if you believe in, I believe in it, it's not an asset bubble. But still, historians later would tell you that was an asset bubble, and you are partly responsible for that. So that makes the monetary and economic policy so complex, so complicated, that we can only be wise ex post.
Would you like to comment on this?
May I have a question on this at this point? And I'm very honored, John, for being invited, and I would like to recognize Mr. Horváth, who is with us, who is the eternal doyen of the Hungarian parliament. I draw the attention of everybody here that he was the member of parliament in 1945, 1947, and re-entered the Hungarian parliament in 1998, after a few decades in the US after 1956. So, thank you for joining us. I would like to ask you a question, both of you actually, Robert and Peter. How about the bubbles these days in China? I read a few articles on this subject recently, and don't you feel that there might be a similar catastrophic consequence of the Chinese bubbles, what we have experienced in the US, and isn't it a danger we need to face and to try to manage before it becomes a very tragic crisis like in 2008?
Isa?
Well, first, the data problem. I spent my early life working for the research institute attached to the Hungarian planning office, at that time the communist regime, and I had a hard time on understanding the data, because the data was not correct, lied. So I shared the views. I don't know who said, probably Churchill. He said things like that I only trust data, that I doctored myself. So I don't know too much about the Chinese data, but well, I bumped into two sets of data. One is the debt per GDP, and it's 280 about so in China. Now, the US debt per GDP, government debt, public sector debt, household debt, so debt per GDP was 180 at the time when the crisis hit the US. So it's a bit higher. Now, you can claim that the Chinese are better running the economy, being a planned economy. Now I've been lived under the planned economy and learned that ember tervez, Isten végez, man proposes, God disposes. So the plan is not a safety belt. The other statistics, I bump into the use of electricity consumption. And in the good old times when we had bad data at the central bank, the GDP was very late and unreliable. What we could measure daily was the electricity consumption. And electricity goes up in the morning and in the afternoon comes down, and month after month, some sort of proxy for economic activity. And what I learned that China last year, it was about flat. So either the Chinese efficiency of use of energy is tremendously good, or they don't grow. So they started to, at least to slow down very much. The statistics good, and the IMF, the most recent IMF, even they even painted a rosy picture. So I don't know. Don't take my word as an investment advice, because I take no responsibility, free of charge particularly. So ask somebody who are much closer and can give you more hint. But I'm a bit, I am worried. And the Hungarian exposure on paper is very much limited. We don't have much Chinese trade. But if I think of the engines, the Audi engines that sold through Germany to China, or the Mercedes-Benz that manufactured in the middle of Hungary, great Hungarian plane, but sold to China, so we are extremely sensitive indirectly through Germany. And then that's why I just watch it carefully, but I have no strong view because I have not seen the small letters of data.
Well, I would say the following. Peter mentions central planning, and you mentioned figures. China is a lie. That's where I start. It's based on a lie. It's a great tradition and supposed great culture, but for the last 70 years, it's been living, 80 years living a lie. The Chinese government invests a lot of money with me. It's really, the government is the Communist Party, really, that's what it really means. And what we have found is that the figures that they use to, like any puppet regime, to create their economic well-being are very often falsified. Number two, there's no rule of law, as we all know. So if you put together what you said, central planning, bad figures, no rule of law, and I'll add a fourth, which is crony capitalism, because there are many, everybody on the Politburo of the Chinese government there is a billionaire. And that what they've done is created a false form of capitalism. Again, I think most of us know, and that false form of capitalism is really an attempt to pacify enough of the people by giving them enough of an opportunity to make money so that they don't rebel. And if you rebel, depending on how strong you are, you either get more or they take you away, like any tyrannical government. So my sense of that economy and my sense of the fragility of it is extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous because it could topple over. They've had bubbles and they've swept it under the rug because they absorb at the central level the losses and the gains. But because of the interconnectivity of the economies, ultimately this thing could slide sideways very seriously. And my worry is if it did, is one, the economic implication, which could be severe, but the other, which is geopolitical, in that the internal debate which goes on in that country, masqueraded again by like-minded species like Obama, is that the Politburo and the political elements and the military are at a constant odds about how they're going to run this thing. And the military in China is an extreme group. They're, as one of the colonels told me, by the way, many of these military guys run, the chairman for CIC, which is the main body that funds their investments around the world, which invests with us. I think for the last 20 years, the head of it has been a military officer. Right? And if you go to the Shanghai hotel, or the Shanghai hotels, or the Beijing hotels, and you go to the very best hotels, when you go to these for a drink at the bar at night, I've been warned about this. Virtually all the people there are military or military intelligence, and they're all in position. So this battle, if there's an economic blight, I believe the military will take more control and could take more control any day. So for me, I view China as our greatest ultimate adversary next time around, apart from Islam.
Good. Well, thank you very much. let me just, before we move away from the effects of the crash and today, I'd like to raise one question, which is the lesson that was drawn by most of the governments was the need for greater regulation. Was that a reasonable judgment? Because after all, when you look at the causes of the crash, it didn't look as though there was lack of regulation, but that instead there was what you might call perverse regulation. Now, I'm going to ask Peter to be the first person to respond to that, and then Zoltan and...
Well, I grew up, as I mentioned, in an over-regulated society, so the first time we could change the system in 1990, then started with a huge deregulation process. And then, of course, you can make mistakes. For instance, I was a minister responsible for tourism, among other things, industry, energy, retail, and others. But so we got rid of all the regulations. And the problem is that it was very easy to establish a company and sell yourself to the general public, and hire a plane and take tourists to Jordan, and then you go bankrupt, and the tourists got stranded in Jordan, and the government agencies and embassies had to bring them back. So there was a bit under regulation, and then decades later, we joined the European Union, and we learned that this is a re-regulation, and the re-regulation is partly understandable because you belong to the same market, so the definition must be the same. But we who joined this club inherited the acquis communautaire with its 68,000 to 70,000 pages of regulation after regulation. The later you join the club, the more acquis you have to accept as given. So it's easier for the founders because they shape it, they learn it, and so that's why I'm a little bit anti-regulation guy. In the financial sector, I don't know. I think cultures differ. So the Hungarian no regulation period between the regime change and in the first year after the regime change led to crises and corruption. And I would say corruption. It's just banks went bankrupt, and it's very hard to distinguish between robbery by daylight or just mismanagement or bad clients. If you lose half of your clients, no bank would survive. So that's why I have no single statement or sentence on it, and I think if I should write about it, it would be a long essay rather than just an easy position. So my position is not ideological, it's more pragmatic, and says in some countries you must have some regulation, otherwise, because you don't have the culture. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, where the self-regulation is strong, and if you misbehave, your competitors and your clients and the stakeholders can push you out of business. Not in Central Eastern Europe, unfortunately. But having said that, if you over-regulate, then it opens the door for corruption, because you will buy the regulator. You try to lobby for different regulation and friendly regulation, and so the path is extremely narrow, and it's not always in the middle, but it's a winding road.
After the transition in Central European countries, we have experienced an extreme liberal approach, and that was not predominantly represented by only the democratic forces, but the democratic forces as well. But when the pendulum went back to the left political forces sold everything what was movable, especially the Horn cabinet between 94 and 98. the strategic energy companies, telecom companies, public utilities, and we arrived after 25 years, by 2010, in a situation where the term of economic patriotism or economic sovereignty became a very important category. And I think that was a crucial factor in the economic stabilization of Hungary after the 2008-2010 crisis, that we have been able to introduce this policy into strategic industries. And now we can say that in the banking sector or in the energy sector or in the public utility sector, we are having a relatively balanced ownership structure between multinationals and national companies. Obviously, some might say that it was an over-regulation, what we have witnessed in the last 7 years in Hungary. Burden sharing, and the bank sector was complaining a lot about that, and the international players echoed this kind of complaint in the last 7 years. But I think the numbers and the economic performance proves that this was successful. And another question, but always it remains a question that define the appropriate equilibrium between this patriotic sovereignist approach and that of the market tendencies. An important factor, I think, in this whole debate is going to be the euro. And after this weekend, after the German elections, we are beyond the French elections, we will face in Europe a major debate on euro, on the management of the euro crisis, if at all. I think it is an important question how we look at now the European economic and financial situation, how our countries who are obliged to join the euro, but how we will manage that. It is not a question to us that we will join the euro, but under what conditions do we decide to join the euro region, and how it will relate to the reforms which will be undertaken as a consequence of the new German and Franco-German angle of the European Union. I think this is now in the guts of Central Europe, everywhere. That's what I'm sure the Hungarian and the Polish Prime Minister will discuss on Friday, what we will do after the German elections and so on. So this is now an extremely important question concerning the future of the EU in general and the subject of regulation. If you read the speech of Mr. Juncker, Juncker said that we need to have tax harmonization on EU level. Basically, this seems to be a fast train which was announced by Mr. Juncker. And other federal elements, a European financial and economic minister to be introduced as a new post and a new player in the European political and economic debates. So the question of sovereignty and communal economic decisions and policies will be not just anymore on the level of nation states and national economies, but on the level of the European Union, become a very hot and major issue.
You've just introduced the topic that I was going to introduce, and so I'm going to ask Robert and then Peter to come back on this, because obviously a lot is happening in Europe. Brexit has occurred. What do you think of that? And secondly, how do you think that Europe should be moving after Brexit? And I mean Europe without Britain, because of the points you have just raised, Zsolt, and which, of course, there is a dispute as to whether Europe should move in a more, so to speak, decentralized liberal direction, or whether it should move in a more corporate and planned direction. So let me throw that hot potato, Robert, into your lap, and then ask Peter to follow up.
First, I would start this way, at a very basic level. What is all this about? This EU, Brexit movement, what is at the core motivator of the alternative of, in my view, a form of tyranny, which is the EU, and after the Magna Carta, probably the single most advanced, strident step taken by a nation to reassert control by the individual. This is at the core of the issue in my mind. The EU, as we all know, was never, ever, never intended to be a political union. This is also another lie. It was meant to be a trade union. It was meant to have trade and harmony between nations who had been at war for centuries. That was what the Treaty of Rome was all about. It was mutated by the likes of Mitterrand and his agent Delors after Monet into this creature, this abomination, which is eating away the lives of people. My advice to Hungary, the proud people of Hungary, is never enter the EU. Do a trade agreement with them. Juncker is a moron. Let me put it frankly to you. He makes no sense at any level. As a leader, he's not a leader, in fact. He's an individual wretchedly torn by the same thesis that have been failed over centuries, in the last century in particular. The European Union will fail, and I'll tell you why it's going to fail. Because it's bankrupt. Germany, because of Schroeder, oddly enough, who made certain changes in the economy, has an export economy, and they make things. France, where I've lived on and off for 31 years, is bankrupt. They were bankrupt. They have been bankrupt for several years. Their state control of their economy is on the tip of 60%. Their social contract, another lie, is a failure. Their healthcare system is a disaster. Their young people are in millions, not in hundreds of thousands, in millions elsewhere. Macron, who will be the end, in my view, of the Fifth Republic, was in New York a day or two ago, trying to explain to French in New York why they should move back to their 72% tax rate. This is idiocy. Okay. I can go on. Brexit, and John's great friend, the Baroness, was right then. She's even more right now. They should have never entered in the first place. It was a weak moment, a failing, led by labor rights in the main, to do something that was dastardly and undermine the nation. You talk a lot about an economic minister for the EU. That makes no sense whatsoever for anybody. My advice to the Hungarian people is stand your ground. Do not go into the EU. Do not go into the euro. Another failure, I might add. It bankrupted all the Southern Rim nations. Italy, there are Italians here. I do business in Italy like the rest of Europe. This system has erased at least one generation. Take a look around. Take a look at jobs. Take a look at income growth. Take a look at unemployment. Take a look at savings. Take Italy. They have, the only thing Italy has, and I defer in this case to my colleague Nani because he's well versed on this, being one of the few, outside of Italy of course, one of the few chief executives of consequence there. There are about 4 by my estimation. Italy has no sovereign wealth. What they have, like a lot of access powers, they had a post office, like they had in Germany, Deutsche Post, Japan Post, Italian Post, where the individual brought their savings because the banking system had crashed. Over time, they've compounded these numbers. So what is Italy doing in light of all this genius, with that last genius, Renzi? What they're doing is taking the money of these small people. They're changing the law at midnight so they can try to turn it around and support their banks. Why are their banks bankrupt? partly because of the 2008 crisis and partly because of the way the euro has evolved and the way governments have taken control of these systems. This is grotesque. And Juncker has to go home. He has to go home, and all of his cronies have to go home. And they're going to be sent packing, because when France fails, it's over.
Well, I predicted disagreement, but I'm now certain of it. Peter.
Well, I will slightly disagree, partly in the language. As ex-central banker and professor, I use the understatement rather than overstatement. I wouldn't call China a lie, and Mr. Juncker called his name. And I'd like to... So Brexit is a different story because we are not Britain. The size, the location, the history. So what may be good for British is not automatically good for small, open, trade-related nations. And I'm old enough to remember that when I went as a tourist to Yugoslavia, a communist country under central planning, nobody accepted, the dinar when I wanted to, find a house or a room. So that was the Deutsche Mark. And went to Poland, and nobody accepted. The taxi driver charged me in Deutsche Mark. So you may not like euro. Footnote: the Americans, they like dollar. They accepted dollar. They know dollar. So that's, to them it's a new thing and it's a bit artificial. But okay, for us the Deutsche Mark is something that we knew from our birth. And even the old regime, I had a bank account in the communist time in Deutsche Mark schilling, because the option, if you don't like euro, then you must have a national currency. Now, Dornbusch, the American professor, visited Central Eastern Europe in the early 90s, and when he learned about the Estonian koruna and the Slovak koruna and Hungarian forint, he referred to this one as funny money. And then he said even Turkey is too small to have a currency of its own. So that's why I may disagree. And going back to patriotic policies, patriotism is my belief. Sovereignty, I'm a bit different. I think the definition of sovereignty may not be the same, because for an economist it's a legal term, but room of maneuver is limited. So you may have a national currency, but you have to defend it. Then somebody may, use it as a toy. So the national currency for a small country, the size of the Hungarian economy, $100 billion, $120 billion GDP, is smaller than Boston. And do we need a Boston currency? Okay. So we'll perhaps discuss this story. But what I'd like to point out, the verdict on Europe is a little bit, I think it's behind the curve. So for 17 consecutive quarters, the Eurozone has been growing. And it created 7 million jobs during this period. So what was true...
Sorry, you think that's growth? You call that growth?
Well, growth is growth because I trust the European figure a bit better than the Chinese figure, or the Hungarian, by the way, because growth is it growth when the Hungarian investment increases by 25% this year? Who can tell me that it's not an overpriced state investment? Okay, so I do trust figures to some degree, and then I think the German economists. So if you don't believe in euro, and some of the in the room, classroom, so to say, don't believe in it, called Deutsche Mark. And you will understand immediately why we economists who know the weaknesses and the fragile, potential fragile situation of small economies like Slovakia, Slovenia. 2 million, Slovenia, 2 million people. Slovakia, 4.5. Estonia, 1.2. But a third of them live in London now. So for them to have a national currency is a joke. Now, then what currency? Well, we can't have the dollar. We don't want to have the yuan or the ruble. Well, what else? Okay, so I would take issue with
Peter, could I just ask a quick
on
technical
ownership issues too, but that would be too much on our plate.
Could I just ask a sort of technical point on this, insofar as I understand it? I can understand why a small country, as Hong Kong was in the transition, say, doesn't want to have its own currency. It ties itself, therefore, to a larger currency. But given the record of the euro in Mediterranean Europe, might it not be better to have what do they call a currency link? As the Argentinians did, but not actual membership of a currency which you can't... go ahead.
Worse, because if it's link, you have to dance with the other guy. So it's a tango. If she moves there, I have to go after whatever I want, you know. So I'm an old guy, I cannot slow down. So if you peg, that's, you get the negative side of it without having a say in it. Now, if you join the Eurozone, and that's the Hungarian Prime Minister and the Central Bank Governor, don't understand what they don't want to talk about. You sit there. You will sit, the Hungarian Central Banker will sit next to the German, and one vote. So it's not even the size. Of course, if the German Central Bank Governor said 9, that's a niet. If the Hungarian would say no, that's I'm not sure that.
Probably.
Yeah, but who knows? Being a genius might convince others. Okay, so my point is that you have to be there when decisions are taken which have an effect on you and euro, whatever. Now, we have investors in this room, and just ask you, gentleman, lady over there, buonasera, what currency you charge when you rent an office space here? Forint? No. You use euro. Our life is euroized, so we are in the eurozone. The only government is not in the eurozone. So,
so you have bank accounts in euro as well.
I do have a bank. I do have, but that's none of your business.
I do have one as well, I tell you. Thank you. So I think this European Union question for us in this room basically is much more an open-ended question than for you, Robert. We haven't finished our intentions and hopes concerning the European Union. But definitely we are now facing quite a difficult period in this regard. And probably it is not the most debated issue in Hungary concerning the euro. We are more or less satisfied with that perspective that we will join the euro sooner or later. We are not in a hurry because we want to see how the Eurozone is going to manage its own internal problems. And I think that is even better for us that we can wait a bit. But as you said, we have got a phase when we will depend on the euro when we decide to enter the Eurozone. But probably the more important question is this issue of political union and federalism, what Robert said. And I think when we talk to Anglo-Saxons, we understand them always, we need to understand them always in the way they mean it. And yes, I think as a consequence of the present post-Brexit situation, we experience in the euro, in the EU, a kind of attitude which doesn't draw the right conclusions from Brexit, but just the opposite. So after Brexit, I believe that we should draw the conclusions that probably we lost Britain, which we shouldn't have done necessarily. There was not a necessity that we will lose Britain in this process. And we lost Britain because of Brussels, because of a Brussels mentality because of a federal notion which was trying to suggest to the British that your parliament is subordinate to the European Parliament, and you shut up, and you do what we tell you. And that was a point when the British said, okay, that was not what we meant. And I think this is when we should consider that, okay, we lost Britain, and what to do not to lose other countries. I think Denmark is the next applicant to get out. If you are curious about my opinion in this regard. If Denmark will leave the EU, I think no one will stop the process. So that's why I think it is high time to draw the right conclusions. And now we have, again, economic growth. I agree with Peter. Yes, it seems that we have got some kind of growth in Europe, over 2%. We have got a very favorable economic climate. We are growing even higher in Central Europe, and I think it's worth talking about Central Europe as well as an important player. But we feel that our voice is marginalized. And we feel that you Central Europeans, you don't matter. You don't even understand what is Europe about. You don't understand democracy. You are authoritarian. You don't behave. You can't use fork and knife. At our table, you are just guests. And you should understand that either you behave and follow us, or you are out. And this is the type of attitude what we tend to feel from Brussels. And we are getting fed up with that as well. And I think that is the real problem of the European Union, that some of them feel in the West that this is the right moment to go ahead with the federal idea. Now we are free from the British. We shouldn't bother with this Central European. Let's go ahead. And I think this is extremely dangerous. And that is the problem with Mr. Juncker, because he is the propaganda leader of this notion. And we don't know how to slow down the dynamism of this approach and how to create a normal response to Brexit and to say, probably we can create a better balance between nations and Brussels. And the test is the migration. And that's why the migration issue is so important. Because if what we say, there are some countries, Orban said the other day, the Prime Minister, you remember in the Hungarian, you had a discussion with him, and the Parliament, he had a speech just the other day. There are countries in Europe who are pro-immigration, fine. We are a country which is not a pro-immigration country. We respect those countries who, for historical reasons, are pro-immigration, but we are not going to join them. And that's what we ask. Allow us not to be a pro-immigration country. Because if you don't allow us not to be a pro-immigration country, then you will crack the ship, the whole ship, what is called the EU. So that's why the migration issue is so critical in this respect. We can imagine an European Union when we recognize that there are some so-called constitutional traditions. Some constitutional traditions are in favor of immigration. Some say that no, it should remain in the capacity of the nation states. And there are a number of other questions which may come under the heading of constitutional identity. But even the term to have constitutional identity means partially sovereignty. This is, I think, the heart of the conclusions after Brexit. Do we recognize constitutional identity in the European Union of nation states or of nations, if you like so, because for us even nation state is not a non-ambiguous category for various reasons, or not? And that's where I think there is really trouble. And if the answer will be negative for our request, that might generate, I believe, serious problems with the future of Europe. I mean the European Union, which you believe us, I'm sure that Fidesz was established in 1988. I'm one of the founding fathers of the party. We are pro-European party. We hope that the European Union can be saved. But we see that there are a lot of tendencies which are against us. And we are interested. I think Hungarians are interested for various reasons, Robert, in the Europe. I mention you just one thing. We are a divided nation. You know, we live in 5 different countries just in the vicinity of us. So we want to belong to one community with our fellow Hungarians who are 30% living outside the Hungarian territory in the neighboring countries. Just to tell you one very obvious reason why we are pro-European. So we want to save this whole project, but we feel that there are major problems inherent now in the public discourse, and we have lost Britain, which Britain was a very disciplinary component in these debates, and now it is, I think, a huge burden is on the shoulder of Germany, the German political life. Are they going to be able? Is CDU or the coalition partner of CDU, because God knows who it will be, not a secondary question, who it will be after this weekend, is wise enough to maintain the unity of the European Union or not?
That's a very important and comprehensive answer. Robert, I'd like to move on to a new topic, but would you like to respond in any way to what you've just said? No?
Just briefly, Peter and Zolt, first, I thought it was very comprehensive as well, but you mentioned Europe. Just my provocative statements by intent. I'm pro-Europe. I'm anti-EU. And I believe the Hungarian people will come down the same way when it's all said and done, for the reasons that you underline in your circle. Okay, number one. Number two, I go back to the basics. We could debate growth. I would disagree with that being growth by my definition, but we're talking about national sovereignty. We're talking about the Judeo-Christian enlightened ethic values of Europe and the right for the individual to pursue his best interest. You start with that and you put it against the measure of this. And I would ask the question, what do you see? And what you see is failure. Big failure. I'm talking about the EU. And the reason Great Britain, London apart, England separated from the EU, was on those fundamental points. The central planners of China are no different than the doyens sitting in the mandarins sitting in Brussels and in Strasbourg. They're the same ethic, they're the same creatures. Whether it's regulation, whether it's budget, we can debate the euro and why the euro is a failure in my view. And it's because of you don't have a federal system. Federal system, you have a national budget. You don't have a national budget control. And the 3% was perforated in 3 seconds flat, as it would be preordained to be perforated when you have a crisis. This circumstance is untenable. That's my message. That's the reality. It would be much more convenient if it worked, but it doesn't work. You talk about immigration, there's the boogeyman. The boogeyman is in the room, which he's going to come on to. The boogeyman is Islam, okay? We're a Judeo-Christian races, and we are Judeo-Christian values. And Churchill was right from day one. when they give up Sharia law, when they embrace our way of life, then we can talk about it. That's what we should do. But if you go to the streets of France, or the streets of Sweden, or the streets of Germany, or Birmingham, absolutely. And the English, by the way, the English are part and parcel of this in spades, again, because of weakness. You see the result. And you don't need to get to big numbers. Sweden is 15%. You don't need big numbers. And I tip my hat to the Hungarian government for having the brains and the bravery to stand up to the lie.
I'm now going to move. We're going to overrun, obviously, because we started late. I've got lots of questions before we finish, and let me now quote something. We have a new American president. He's been highly controversial. He's just made a major speech at the United Nations. Prior to that, he made a very important speech in Central Europe, in Poland, in which he said a number of things. He greatly praised Poland. I would have thought the heart of every Pole really surged as they were listening to what he said. But then he said this, this directly picks up your last remarks, Robert. We, meaning the West, are the fairest and greatest community. There is nothing like our community of nations. The world has never known anything like it. We write symphonies, we pursue innovation, we celebrate ancient heroes, embrace timeless traditions, and always seek to explore and discover brand new frontiers. And then he went on to say a number of other things in the same vein, very eloquently. Commenting on this, one of your predecessors, Geza Jasenski, says in the current issue of the Hungarian Review, he quotes this and he says, "This is indeed a crucial, do we have the will to defend this? This is indeed a crucial issue. Losing their will and determination to stand up for their own achievements and bearing sacrifices for them has probably become the most serious danger facing Western societies. Trump was right in asking, do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it?" And my question to all of you is, do we? And if we don't, how can we recover it? And I want to throw in with that the question of our relationship with Israel, because Israel is part of our world. And there's recently been a very important meeting here between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Orban. First of all, Zolt, I think it obviously goes to you.
Thank you. I think it was a great speech of Trump. And I think it was important that he had his first great speech ever, I think, in Central Europe and in Warsaw. So I think we were very honored because of that. And I would throw a bit back the ball to the United States. And I think a major question is that, would he say the same speech today? Where are the speechwriters? Are they still around who wrote that speech? And I think a major question is internal. What's happening inside the U.S.? Because we are grateful for your advice to us what to do in Europe with the EU. But how about the State Department, the State Administration of the United States? How does it look like? Is Donald Trump able to take it over slowly or not? Or it will be an ongoing fight which will make the U.S. ungovernable. We don't really, the numbers are fantastic. We are glad to see that the American economy is thriving, and it seems that there have been basically good decisions throughout the past period in the United States. So out of this whole debates and smoke which comes out of DC, the decisions are basically promising. But there seems to be a quite decisive internal fight. And the outcome of that requires, I think, an American to judge it properly. The second comment I would like to make is Central Europe. So that speech in Warsaw identified Central Europe as an entity. And don't forget what was the reason for the visit of Trump to Warsaw. That was the so-called Trimarium summit, first ever, when the Nordic Sea, Black Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea countries have been invited, all NATO and EU members, for this summit. And that region, Central European region, is trying to emancipate itself, and that is a top priority for the Hungarian foreign policy, to make it a player, to make it an entity. And that's where the Visegrad presidency of Hungary now is trying to aim at, and the Polish-Hungarian cooperation is trying to aim at. And we believe in it, we hope for it, but there are tremendous counterbalance and opponents of this Central European cooperation we are facing with. And if we are successful or not depends partially on us, partially on our environment, Eastern, Western, and obviously the United States. It was not an accident Donald Trump had that speech there. So that is Central Europe and Visegrad and the Polish-Hungarian perspective, which I wanted to place on the table. And finally, Israel. Yes, we had a diplomatic high season this year, and going to have as well. For example, the Chinese Prime Minister will meet the 16 Central European countries' Prime Ministers in Hungary in November. And we all had very negative comments on the very regular visit of Mr. Putin to Budapest, but that is a signal. And obviously other, Mr. Sisi, unfortunately the Egyptian ambassador has left us. Probably there was a reason for that, but we have to talk to him. And Mr. Sisi and Mr. Netanyahu was here in the middle of the summer. And there Viktor Orban found important to state that the state of Israel is bastion of European civilization in the Middle East. This sentence I wanted to quote from Viktor Orban. The state of Israel is the bastion of the European civilization in the broader Middle East. And I think that is a kind of mentality how we look at the state of Israel. And there have been in Hungary quite interesting cross-party and cross-parliamentary period consensus about that since 1990 continuously. And that's what we are going to remain. And I think this kind of attitude on behalf of Europe is vitally needed. This option and this approach in our Central European community, it is more or less the approach. And that is not the case with most of the Nordic and other West European countries in the European Union. So we have got very strong debates in the Foreign Affairs Council meetings and at Coreper levels 1, Coreper 2 on our Israeli policy. But that is well thought, and we are committed to that. A subsidiary to this question is that we have got in Hungary a large 200,000 Jewish community, third largest in Europe after Britain and France. And probably the environment is not the worst among these three in Hungary. In France, there have been last year 800 anti-Semitic incidents. And in the last 10 years, 14 Jews have been killed in France because of their Jewry. We don't have this type of statistics in Hungary. And hope we are not going to have. But on the contrary, the Jobbik, so-called Hungarian Guard, was practically banned, which was a violent anti-Semitic organization, and hate speech is now in Hungary rolled out by law. So I think this is a record which has been now recognized finally by the visit of the Israeli Prime Minister. We have been waiting for a bit long for that, but finally it happened, and hope that we will be able to build in the future on the visit and on the consequences of this visit. Thank you very much.
To say, Robert, you're a philanthropist and have given generously to various causes, including, I think, causes connected with the State of Israel. Do you have anything you want to add here?
I think that statement, I underline a lot of what Zsolt said. I mean, the will to defend this is a big question. It's a question shared by the United States, England, and all European powers. And I would say two things. I work a lot with Bibi Netanyahu and Israel, and I'm Catholic. Israel is, in my view, the front line of defense of who we are, period. Number two, I would say that as a matter of history, it has been people like the Hungarians and the Poles who've actually stood up and fought to defend these values. And I would go further that in the last century, it was the English and the Americans who came behind you, frankly, to defend those freedom fighters when we were faced with the ultimate tyranny all the way through the Cold War. And I would say to this question, whether it's the EU proper or the centers of the EU or the Western, far Western nations, my answer is I'm not sure. I'm not sure they'll stand up. The first thing you have to do is to be willing to name your enemy, as opposed to being put in jail for doing so. The second thing you have to do is you have to be prepared to confront your enemy. And when you're at war, the purpose of war is to destroy the will and backbone of your enemy and force them to surrender. We are nowhere near that right now. How would you like to have, as I did, my son's best friend, my son is half French, at the Baclan Theater, and have him sitting there and playing dead, and having a terrorist come up, grab him by the head and ask him, is this your friend? He said, yes. And then cut his head off and put it on his chest and say, that's to remember who we are. You didn't see that in the French press. We are at war, and this statement is vitally important to our very existence. In my book, the EU is just an extension of the weakness and cowardice. That may sound provocative, but it's factually ascertainable. And the French, again, I live a long time in France. I mean, I am not sure whether the French would show up, frankly. I am simply not sure. And I know the Hungarians would show up. I know the Poles would show up. I know the English would show up. And then even in England, we have the problem. Even in England, England is not perfect. And that same disease, the United States is not immune. The same disease is at work on the campuses across America. And until we have the backbone to answer this in the affirmative through specific action like the two I mentioned, and there are others, I don't know.
Comment on this? Talking about the social crisis of the West, of course.
To history, that certainly there has always been a cross-party consensus on the right of Israel to exist and peacefully, and also an understanding about the Western alliance. So that's been the main theme of the mainstream parties. Now, what is inside the countries, to me, is some sort of black box. For instance, Israel, I was the first minister to open a touristic office in Israel in 1990, and visited the country, and I met with three ministers, because the Minister of Industry, Minister of Defense Industry and Tourism, I had a huge portfolio, three different persons, three different parties, so I just couldn't figure out who is the, and they were not, the same view on things. So to me, Israel, like the Dutch with their 17 parties, a little bit too complex. But fortunately, that's not my job. It's your job to find a good Jew among the best Jew among the good Jews in Israel, because the parties differ. Now, but you received a question and you didn't answer the U.S. policies. So Mr. Trump's position, there was a bold statement and a very promising statement that
is he winning?
The national interest of the United States will be carried through. But which Trump? Because we have seen changes, and vis-à-vis Russia, for instance, where does he stand now on Russia? On China, it has not changed much. On some Arabic countries, on the being passive or proactive. If you're proactive, unfortunately, you have to be international and use the, for foreign ministry type of knowledge, the State Department. So which Trump? Because it's not easy to
yeah, but I mean, I did pass over this point about the State Department is a disaster. Foggy bottom, as it's so called. John Bolton, our good friend, should have been Secretary of State. He was what the conservatives wanted. But you say which Trump? There's so many different Trumps, right? And so he chose someone who is ill-equipped for that job. He will never, Tillerson, I think Tillerson will be gone soon, but he'll never be able to change the State Department. He's not interested in it. He's kept most of the Obama appointees in place. Terrible situation. We're 9 months into the administration, and I'd say foreign policy is one of his biggest shiftless acts that he's done. So I don't know the answer on that myself. I do know, I think he is supportive of Israel. I think if an ally were ultimately attacked, I think he would defend it. And I can't say the same for Obama, but I think Donald Trump will.
We've got to start coming to an end. It's a marvelous discussion, but we are slightly overrunning. But I will take one or two very quick questions from the audience, if there are any. I have one up my own sleeve, if not. Anyone like to ask a question? Please raise your hand. Yes. Janos.
In the inventory, what we had here, what we are having here, there are some points which especially hit me, or I recommend for further elaboration, such as competition. Earlier in the presentation, the thought was pronounced, and I find it definitely more important than it is lived up to nowadays in the European Union and in Hungary. Competition. A free market, which is traditionally or pragmatically, is facilitating for the economy to reach optimal. And then instead of the European Union especially, but Hungary is not more virgin in this matter, the government or oligarchic institutions take more role than what is more than optimal. For Hungary, the small country, we somehow do not recognize it, or it is not spared enough that a small country has the right to life if it differs. Only through its excellence excellence in the nobility of the institutions, the living of life, and becoming attractive for emulation. Hungary is not doing that, what is capable of, to present herself to herself and to the rest of the world, or to Visegrad. But in Visegrad, probably yes, but not for the Union, to show ourselves that we differ and we can be different, presenting itself, not representing itself, appearing to the rest of the world that wants to not emulate, I've tried to find a better word, to appreciate that what Hungary is different. Hungary could be, and especially for Németh Zsolt's exposition, I add, because Hungary is not as competitive economy as potentially could be. Hungary is flirting with, or more in the shadow of oligarchy than could be. Therefore, Hungary is behind herself. The potential what Hungary is capable, would be capable of doing if, again, I come back to the competitive system. So I would propose even bringing together a panel on this subject, that being behind of ourselves, and what we heard here on this panel are elements, components to my thesis. And thank you, John, for asking me. And I am sometimes, well, restraining myself for elaborating, because for me, this is the thing. This is the thing. Thank you.
Well, first of all, János, you speak with several authorities here, one of which as a distinguished economist. So, thank you. And now I would like to, anyone else want to come in with a question before I hand it back? Well, I'm going to add a question, and it's more or less prompted by János, and then I'll ask all of you to respond and we'll finish. The question is this. Zsolt, you were one of the founding members, I think the number 2 member of Fidesz. And I think if you have to define narrowly what Fidesz's purpose was, it is, among other things, it is a middle-class party, and it's trying to create a stronger, more effective middle class in this country as the basis of a good economy and a strong nation. Are we going about it the right way? And if we're not, how should we go about it? And since you're not here, Robert, you may not know, but I'm sure you have good ideas on how to help to create a middle class, because it is the preoccupation of most economists and political leaders in the world today. First of all, why don't we start at the far right and come back this way? Peter.
Well, this is an old theme, because the Untitled cabinet had a policy, a very, very clear and non-mainstream policy, the Sozialmarktwirtschaft, which has nothing to do with the softy welfare state, but the competition. So the competition that create a regulatory framework, a strong state, but too strong for an Anglo-Saxon, that creates clear rules, and therefore the Mittelstand, the middle classes can prosper and not only depend on foreign capital and big institutions like trade unions and something. It failed, but failed not only in Hungary, it failed in Germany. And the main theme is the competition. And when we discussed the passing the regulatory reform, I should have had the main test. Reforms, regulations, do they serve competition or they kill competition? That's the test. because you can regulate well, wisely, and then the end result is that talented people get the job. The most efficient producers produce things, and not those who have, you know, close links to the political regime or friend or married into the family of the king or something. So, okay. I'm a bit unhappy on this front, not just for the present government. We discussed the university, and you know, I have critical comments, but I'm not going to say. But I just like to point out something which was not mentioned, but it's on the list: the Silk Road and other big items. Now we'll skip it probably for lack of time. But the present government just, you know, used the opportunity to send a message, because I don't see the people recently. So the politicians love the big, you know, enormous projects that may turn around the economy, Olympics, or the nuclear power station, or the Silk Road, or the high-speed train between. Well, I don't want to mention two small places on the map. You know, mention two small American cities and then build, which would accelerate the inflow of Chinese goods. Yeah, okay. Is it the national interest? Will we, Mittelstand, profit from it? The Hungarian middle class, Mittelstand, small and medium enterprises have a radius, and this is about 500 miles. So China is for the big guys, not for us. Of course, you have to be in the game, but don't expect that you sign a very expensive project and that would catapult the Hungarian economy into high growth path. So that's my warning, and I talk a lot to the SME folks. I'm some sort of chairman advisory for the Hungarian SME Society, and they are unhappy with the government. The government speaks a lot about the national interest, and then, you know, you offer a lot of monies to cash-rich American and German and other multinationals, national companies, and also you seem to believe in huge projects rather than believing in the small projects by the thousands. And then I think is the formula in Central Eastern Europe for success. So that's, we won't discuss it, but I was happy to let it, you know.
Thank you very much, Peter. Zeld.
Thank you very much, János Bátyánk, for your comments. The competitivity is the key word for the future of Hungary. And as for all those regions of Europe which are backsliding, and that is the problem, that we have far too many regions in Europe which are backsliding. And Hungary is among the regions which still had a chance to become a competitive region of the EU. And we should grab that opportunity. I think that is the major question to us. And I agree with you, Ákos, that the large multinationals and the investors will not necessarily create only this competitivity. But we need to try to radiate this towards the small and medium size of enterprises. We need to have a successful training and education reform into this direction. And I think not just university level, but this kind of professional training, which is in the pipeline, but we should make a breakthrough with this, which is decided. And in our social policy, that kind of social conservatism, which is characteristic for Fidesz, I think I can be the most relaxed and set and happy about that, because I think this family values, pro-family policy is integrated into the tax system, making children demography as a kind of driving force for the future. It is needed. And migration vis-à-vis this family policy has got a very real political option now, and that is perceivable by now on a European level. And probably the regional dimension is the last one which I would like to subscribe also to. So Central Europe, we should integrate more and more into each other. And that is a basic national interest of us Hungarians, but I think for the whole region this is a crucial question. And that's where still these infrastructural questions come into the picture, and not necessarily the speedway between Budapest and Belgrade, but to create an energy infrastructural network inside Central Europe, which creates favorable conditions for the economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
The point of competition and the Mittelstand. Mittelstand is the same genie in the bottle in every nation, whether it's Hungary or England or the United States. We talk about big companies. Nani ran the biggest industrial company in the world. But that really doesn't drive an economy, nor does the Olympics, nor does a power station in Chinese money. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, amongst others, but particularly those two, understood this. They understood the working man, the very famous, as John Untitled probably wrote the speech, shopkeeper's daughter and the shopkeeper on the corner. That's how you create economic growth. And the government's job, in my ideal, is to get out of the way. The government doesn't do anything really well in any country. They just got to get out of the way. Yes, we have to make sure there's certain restraints and there's certain things where, as you say, regulation helps, Peter, but it's minimal. It should be minimized. My argument with the EU is it is an albatross on the individual. It has to go. And if you take that simple approach, which is the purity and beauty of Reagan and Thatcher, beyond what they did, as John wrote so eloquently, local Pope John Paul did, to break tyranny. Apart from that, what they did in their own countries is they gave people hope. They gave the individual a chance to go out and make a living and grow for their families. They reinstituted the notion of God in our lives. The left is perpetually trying to put themselves on top of the pyramid of natural law. It's another lie. The EU is a lie. The EU is a lie. It's the same thing. It's a socialistic mechanism. If you get these things out of the way and out of people's lives, there's no limit to what can happen. That was what the story and the history of enlightenment is. And my message, you come from a good party. On a relative scale, you're at the top of my personal tree in terms of people who are doing the right things. But as I said to your prime minister today, I would rate him probably #1 in Europe. There is no leadership in Europe today. And Trump is Trump. Why did Trump get elected? He's a populist. He's not a conservative. Trump got elected because he understood this point. He knew how to make a message to famous flyover company. New York and Los Angeles are not the United States of America. America is what's known as flyover country. The hideous Hillary Clinton was defeated, routed in a federalist system that we have, the Electoral College. She was routed, and she was routed by the shopkeepers. Yeah. And that was the genius of Trump, and it's the genius of the reverse road up serfdom.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had an extraordinarily lively, entertaining, and important debate. We've disagreed and agreed. I thought one interesting point was on the biggest picture of all, the defense of the West and Western civilization, there was complete agreement on the panel. On other questions, there was less agreement. That was very obviously the case. And of course, I think there's more discussion and debate on the right between what you might call liberal conservatives and national conservatives than there is in this country between the various sections of the left. This is where the debate is being held, and that's why we're very happy to be part of it. I would say, as a liberal conservative, I would say to my national conservative friends, I would quote a story. A friend of mine was once asked the question, Arthur Shenfield, a British economist, the member of the audience after he spoke said, "Can you tell us what the difference is really between the public sector and the private sector?" And he replied, "Certainly. The private sector is controlled by the government. The public sector isn't controlled by anybody." And that's a cautionary tale, I think, for conservatives who are tempted to the left. But having said that, I want to thank our three speakers, and particularly Robert for coming here, taking time out of his busy schedule to come to Hungary. We're delighted he was here. We're delighted we could find for him two such fitting antagonists or collaborators or whatever as Zsolt and as Peter. We've had a very high quality discussion and a very lively one. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank them very warmly indeed. Good. That was terrific. Gentlemen, thank you.